So you know, the Sweden of today is very different from the Sweden of about 40 years ago. I mean, back in the 1980s, it pretty much would have been inconceivable that one of the strongest political forces in the country would be a party of the far right. And even more inconceivable, perhaps, would have been Sweden joining the NATO military alliance. And that's because the country was always really known as a bastion of Nordic social democracy. And that variant of social democracy, at least here, seemed to go hand in hand with a policy of non-alignment. In fact, its champion, a man by the name of Olof Palme, was seen as a very strong advocate of the liberation of global South countries, from apartheid, from colonialism, from the grip of the West. So he often did come into the crosshairs of even the United States. That being said, Palme dies, well, quite a gruesome death by assassination on February 28th of 1986. And I would argue, really, that begins the very slow death of social democracy itself. The mystery of his death, however, still remains reasonably unsolved in 2024. Well, it's rather hard to believe because the building doesn't look like much today. It's just a souvenir shop, but literally this is where Olof Palme and his wife Lisbeth would have lived at the time of his assassination on February 28th, 1986. And in fact, what would have happened is he would have returned home, presumably from a long day of work, around 6:30 p.m. And by that time, she had already made plans for them to go out that evening with their son Martin and his girlfriend to the cinema. Now, basically, he had declined any additional, bodyguards or security for that evening, and they left to head over to the cinema sometime after 8:30 p.m. So we're going to trace their footsteps today and actually take the metro up to where they would have gotten off to head to the cinema. Okay, so to follow in their footsteps, we have to take this 3 stations north to Rådmansgatan. And I believe this is going to be us. I'm sure the trains have been greatly updated since they took it back in 1986, but nonetheless. Wow, makes me want to come back to Stockholm and just do a metro tour, maybe on the next trip. But for now, let's try to find the right exit so we can make our way to, hopefully it's still there, I believe it is, the Grand Cinema, where Olof Palme and his wife would have met up with their son at 9 p.m. or slightly after 9 p.m. on that very fateful evening. All right, so come out at the station. And I believe this is already the street where everything would have gone down on that night. So as we make our way towards the cinema, fingers crossed, I think it's worth reflecting a little bit more on exactly who Olof Palme was. Now, Palme was the leader of the Social Democratic Workers' Party from 1969 through to the moment of his assassination. And he was actually prime minister during that period twice. First from 1969 to 1976, and then from 1982 to that very fateful day. And the thing is, I mean, Palme, he was actually united with Western leaders when it came to critique or criticism of Soviet foreign policy. policy. So, for example, he would always criticize, let's say, the Soviet intervention in Czechoslovakia, the situation in Afghanistan, things like this. At the same time, what separated him from Western leaders was his very robust support for, again, global South liberation movements. I mean, he was the first Western leader to visit revolutionary Cuba and actually, stand with Fidel Castro in a square in Santiago. He supported the FSLN, the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, at the same time when the United States was giving weapons to the Contras. He, for example, was a vehement supporter of the Palestinian struggle, opposed apartheid South Africa at every turn. So this definitely did put him in a contradiction with the United States and with NATO. In fact, in 1972, relations with the United States for a time broke off. They broke off because of his critique of the Hanoi bombing. So it gives you a sense of how he was a very unique figure among Western leaders in general. Yeah, so this is it. The cinema's still clearly standing, still clearly going, still clearly open. And yeah, basically this is where the couple would have met their son on that night, around 9 p.m. And the thing is, they hadn't pre-booked tickets, so actually Olof Palme was offered from the ticket clerk the theater director's seats because, of course, he was the prime minister and he was recognized on site. So yeah, they would have been here a little bit after 9 p.m. and then I guess would have come out of the cinema a little bit after 11 and then parted ways after a short conversation. So Olof and Lisbeth would have strolled down this street after the film, deciding to take a slightly different route home, so walking down to the next metro station, and eventually they would have decided to cross the street. So right after this urban deli, this is basically where the couple would have been approached from behind by a man who we still don't know. We have no idea who he is to this day, even though the Swedish authorities say they've solved the crime as of 2020. We'll get into that later. But yeah, would have approached them from behind and at point blank range would have shot Olof right here. And you can see just how close they were to the metro station, Hötorget, that they wanted to use to get back to Gamla stan. So it would have only been 2 stops back, basically to their community, a very short hop back. And of course, he never made it. And the killer, well, he was last spotted actually running down here, Tunnelgatan, and up these steps. So we'll see as far as we can get up the steps ourselves, just to give ourselves a little bit of a sense of what he would have gone through on that particular night. And either on this side or on the other side, it's hard to know, but this would have been where the killer ran up the steps and escaped forever. Well, maybe. So I have to wonder if it was actually on this very street, which is very, very quiet even now. It's early evening here in Stockholm, where the killer got away for good, maybe to never be seen. Or maybe he was, who knows? I mean, the thing is, in 1988, the authorities actually said that they cracked the case. A guy by the name of Christer Peterson is convicted. He had said that it was a case of mistaken identity. Peterson was somebody who struggled with drug addiction, and he thought that the guy was somebody else and, well, basically killed Olof Palme as a consequence. Well, the thing is, he ends up being actually exonerated, and he dies in 2004 with his name cleared. And then in 2020, the Swedish authorities said they once again cracked the case. A guy by the name of Stig Enström, who is known as the Skandia Man, well, he's actually said to have been the one who, decisively, they could now determine, committed the murder. And he was called the Skandia Man because he worked in that building, basically right next to or right on the corner where Palme was killed. And apparently it was just a case of, well, he didn't like Palme's policies. He didn't like socialism. He didn't like the social welfare system. I mean, maybe it was that, or maybe it was the foreign policy, but he had a gripe with Palme. The thing is, there's a ton of other theories. That it was basically the Chilean fascist junta in cahoots with the CIA, maybe as part of Operation Gladio, that network of operations that the CIA and NATO conducted all across Europe and really the world against revolutionaries and left-wing activists and politicians, leaders. Maybe that it was the PKK. That's a rather bizarre one. That's pretty much been discredited at this time. Or that it was apartheid South Africa, or any of the other fascist forces across the world that maybe, wanted to see Palme gone from the political map. And I guess you can say that it's very fitting that it's only a block away where Olof was laid to rest, here at the Adolf Fredriks Church. Quite a surreal feeling to actually see where he's buried, and along with his wife now as of 2018, so she lived for quite a while longer. But yeah, I mean, the world definitely became a worse place after his death, in Europe especially. I mean, within a few years, some very interesting developments happened. I mean, the first thing, of course, is the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the socialist camp. And that also had an effect on social democracy. I mean, social democracy also began to, you could say, fall apart during this period. The Western powers no longer felt the need to sort of appease their populations with all of these social welfare policies. And the social democratic parties became eventually, at least in terms of leadership, largely indistinguishable from neoliberal parties. I mean, before we knew it, we had Tony Blair and Gerhard Schröder, and basically austerity was the way to play the game, the so-called third way, which now has changed a bit. I think obviously we've seen that we did not reach the end of history, and I think people like Olof Palme, their story is more and more relevant. And in an age where the far right is sort of gaining in popularity all across the European continent, I think we can really take a lot of lessons and influence we should really be taken from the likes of Palme. Well, I thought it was time to actually end the video, but I wasn't really satisfied with the way we left things and the fact that there was not a single flower on Olof's grave. So here we are, gonna head back in just a moment. Okay, now I think it's time to go.